Hello, welcome to the Good Grazing Makes Sense channel. I'm Dave Voth. This is brought to you by the Society for Range Management. We've been having some discussion about grazing during the growing season. And depending on where you are, that season may be pretty short. We talked to John Locke recently out of Texas, who's got an 11-month growing season with 50 inches of rain. And there can be challenges in any environment, in any context. But today we have Sherm Swanson, specifically from Nevada, to talk about grazing during the growing season in the arid West. And I feel like there's this kind of fine line during the stage between rapid growth and seed head production or even senescence as to whether you're grazing for the benefit of that plant or you're negatively affecting that plant. This came about through a question onto the Facebook: how to best graze during the growing season. What's our best bet to graze for the health of the plant? Sherm, can you give us a little background and let's just start jumping in and geeking out about plants and grazing?
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation, Dave. I'm honored to be able to talk to your guests. People who care about grazing management are dear to my heart. So it's something I've been stewing about for a few decades here in Nevada, the driest state in the nation. And of course, the interesting thing about Nevada is that we have growing seasons from very short to very long. And the big difference between those in Nevada is those places that are close to water tend to have a long growing season, and places that are on much less water holding capable soils and where we don't have groundwater coming up, those have a short growing season. It tends to be too cold in the winter, and then it dries out. And by the time it dries out, the plants quickly lose their soil moisture, and so they go into senescence, summer dormancy. And of course, once they go into summer dormancy, they're much less susceptible to grazing. Not zero susceptibility, but much less, because they don't need their leaf area that year to grow more photosynthetics, the carbohydrates and the proteins and the things that they use to grow roots and more leaves. The leaves are the forage, but they're also the factory. And so uh, one way to graze is to moderately use the plants so that they still have leaf area during the growing season when there's still enough warmth and enough soil moisture for them to be in that window. And the other is to graze them even maybe relatively severely, but only briefly, so that they have an opportunity to then regrow their leaves, and then those leaves can be available because they're not getting grazed off. It's important to manage the plants so that they have the ability to grow and regrow. And you can really take either fork in the road, but it's a pretty significant difference in your grazing management approach strategy, whether you're grazing for moderate use or whether you're grazing for a quick use and then regrowth without use. And I think either can work, but whatever you use as your strategy, that's what you ought to focus on, plan on, and monitor.
What conditions and management styles need to be in place to make moderate grazing work? That first style you were talking about.
Yeah, it is a challenge. A couple of colleagues of mine said that in a desert pasture with no riparian area, you could stock it for the year. And by stocking it properly for the year, the amount of the plants that they eat during the growing season would be low to moderate, because the growing season is a short part of the year. And if that was the fraction of the use, then it would be moderate use on average. But the plants that are the same species, even right next to each other, one may get bitten first, and then when it regrows, the animals want to regraze that one again. And the one right next to it that has more thatch or more older leaves doesn't get bitten that second time, and so it continues to accumulate thatch, and the other one gets overgrazed because it gets grazed over and over and over again. And so I think this moderate use idea is indeed a challenge, as you suggest. And I think the secret sauce for managing cows, especially, well, maybe everywhere, but especially in places where we've got the potential for hot spots or the risk of light to moderate use causing the animals to graze the best and fertilize the rest, and then developing use patterns within a pasture that perpetuate year after year. And those same plants get grazed hard every year, and other plants get not grazed enough every year. And so we have both overuse and underuse in the same pasture, and sometimes even of the same species. But when we've got different species in a pasture, that problem gets to be even worse because different species of grasses or different species of plants are differentially palatable, attractive to the animals. Of course, the other thing is that shifts a bit throughout the year. Some plants are more palatable certain times of the year than other plants are. And maybe an advantage of grazing over a long period is that animals do a little bit of switching up on their own. But each season, they still might be grazing the best individuals or their favorite places and not the rest. Distribution is perhaps the biggest challenge we have in grazing management. I've said that for years. And maybe it's the biggest opportunity we have because of the pervasiveness of the problem. But then there's the question of how do you fix that problem, and and how do you know whether you're doing it very well? And both of those can be a challenge. Um, and cross fencing pastures is certainly a way to do it. And then you can concentrate your animals on one side or one fraction of the area and then move them about so that when they're in a particular area, they're getting even use on all those plants and then moving on to another area.
Even the best cross fencing situation is still dependent on that water. Water is the limiting factor, and
Absolutely.
cross fencing a pasture with no water in it does nobody any good.
No,
Uh, so have you done much with this virtual fence? Is that a management tool to get to this goal you're talking about of um, getting away from graze the best, fertilize the rest?
I am really excited about this tool, but as you point out, you still have to have the water.
Hmm.
In some, and of course, the heart of the water issue is the riparian issue, and the heart of the riparian issue is the dependence of the riparian water vessel and the storage sponge on vegetation. So if we graze that in a way that we lose the vegetation or lose the soil and lose the sponge, then we lose the water. Maybe in some places we can actually do things like wetland restoration and create the water. And in any case, whenever we graze an area that depends on the riparian vegetation in order to store the water, if we do that wrong, the consequences are big. And if we do it right, the consequences are huge, especially for the everything, wildlife and livestock and recreation and. And so it's been a real topic, a real focus throughout my career. In some cases, we may be able to have a perennial stream down through a pasture. And with virtual fence, we could use each part of that stream for a part of the grazing season, and then move on to a different part of the stream and use it for a part. And that allows all the parts to get most of the grazing season, grazing period, as a recovery period. And it's the recovery period that is huge in the long-term success of riparian plants and the sponge, the riparian functions.
I noticed that you said recovery, not rest. Is there a difference in those two terms?
I like the Society for Range Management definition of rest, which is the whole growing season or maybe the whole year without grazing. Whereas deferred rotation has a recovery period if the part of the growing season is not during the grazing season. And I'm basically usually prefer that deferred rotation over rest rotation because we can use all of the parts of the pasture every year. And if we do it in a way that does not cause that pasture part that's getting grazed that year to be abused, then we could be doing more good than bad with our grazing. And that's the key. Also, back on this water question, one thing about cows is they won't stand in line to get a drink of water. If they have to wait too long, they're going to go look for water somewhere else, and pretty soon um, you're not doing the concentrated herd, short duration, long recovery period grazing that you intended to do. So it's important not only to have water, but to have big water, big enough water that the whole herd that you're trying to graze together as a unit can get water within a relatively short time.
I want to get back to this recovery idea, and you created a picture for us of a pasture, kind of a monoculture, and a cow takes one bite of one plant, and as that plant is recovering, while everything is growing, what makes that plant that's been bitten more tender or more susceptible to the second bite than the plant right next to it that's still growing but is not in a recovery phase?
Well, it's got young, fresh leaves
And
that are photosynthetically active, and those cell walls are thin, and the insides of the cells are active, and that's where the nutrition is. There's some cellulose in the cell walls, some energy, but the protein is mostly on the inside of the cells. And young cells have more of that good stuff on the inside and less of the cellulose on the outside as a proportion. As leaves mature, they get to be older and more rank, and that decreases their palatability. It also decreases what the cows sense, which is the post-ingestive feedback, the way their gut tells the brain about what the quality of what they were eating. And based on that post-ingestive feedback, cows are going to school every day of their life, learning about which plants are good to eat and make them feel good, and which plants don't. Every plant can be toxic at too high a level, and every plant can be nutritious at some level. But of course, some plants are more toxic, and we call those poisonous plants. But cows like to mix it up, but they still like the stuff that makes them feel good, and that's going to be a combination of energy and protein to keep it simple.
so it's more than just it is part of it, the tenderness of the plant. The cell wall is not rigid yet, but you're saying it's also a nutritional issue. There's more nutrition in that younger or regrowing plant.
And for that reason, some people use virtual fence not because they have a distribution problem that they're trying to fix, so much as because they want to put extra weight on their animals. On private property, a lot of people in the Great Plains, even though they got very long growing seasons, are using virtual fence as a way to do rotational grazing so they can keep their animals on a higher plane of nutrition and get more productivity out of their grass. And
Production going up while rangeland health is going up at the same time. It's kind of what good grazing makes sense is all about.
there you go. Yeah.
So we've talked in the past about a tool to measure how we're doing during the growing season. It's called the Grazing Response Index. Can you give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of what the Grazing Response Index is and what it does for us?
Well, the reason I'm excited about the Grazing Response Index is that I was involved in the first Nevada Rangeland Monitoring Handbook. And back then in the 80s, the assumption or the presumption was that Nevada rangelands were overgrazed. And therefore, if you think of it as overgrazed, you think of it as overstocked, and therefore, an awfully big part of the of that handbook was that we monitor utilization. Since then, other use criteria have been brought into play, and some places they use stubble height instead of utilization. Some places they use residual dry matter. Some places they use the woody plant use, and some places they use stream bank alteration or green line alteration. And all of those are assuming that the big tool in the toolbox is the stocking rate. And of course, a lot of range management books inform us that stocking rate is important. And if we're going to do long seasons of use, stocking rate is our big tool. But as we've been talking, it's only one tool. And if we're going to move animals in order to increase range health or plant health or riparian health or riparian functions or any of our goals, then we would want to think about the other things that influence the plant and the health. And it's the rebiting of the same plant over and over again that has been shown in research to start to really impact a plant. Much more than utilization the first time, it's the utilization the second, or in some cases, the third and fourth and fifth time during that growing season. Maybe each time it's a little bit shorter, maybe each time you've just taken away the food factory. But in any case, it's that overuse. So the overabundant use, repetitive use, that's the problem. Think about that is simply the duration of the grazing season within the growing season. And if we're there for the animals to graze a plant and then move on before the plant regrows enough to get to be more attractive than the ungrazed plant. And the ungrazed plant also has the advantage of having maybe long leaves, and the tongue can get wrapped around those leaves and be hauled in easily and efficiently. So they don't want to have to graze with their lips a young plant. They'd rather wrap their tongue around a plant because it's much more efficient. But still, at some point, those leaves get to be long enough, and then the animal's going to want to graze the new one because it's fresh. And so, how long is that? Well, it varies depending upon the rate of plant growth. And some plants, like basin wild rye, grow really fast, and other plants not so much. And so it's probably variable, but the principle is that if the animals are starting to graze that plant a second time, you're beginning to go past the this grazing was good for the plant to this grazing is maybe neutral to the plant. And if they're there long enough for that plant to get grazed a third time or more, then you're starting to drive that plant downhill. And the more you graze it again, the more often you graze it again, then the more downhill you drive it. And so in the Grazing Response Index, you call that frequency of grazing, and you evaluate it as basically time for one bite plus one. Time enough for a second bite, neutral, 0. Time enough for a third bite or more, -1. So it's pretty simple math. But the point is, how long are the animals there during the growing season? And we're thinking during the growing season because of that physiological activity of the plant as it's growing. And the frequency is one of 3 metrics in the Grazing Response Index. So we include the intensity because stocking rate is important and having leaf area is important. And so that's another one of the metrics. If the grazing is light so that the plant has lots of leaf area, say 64%, that's the magic number in the Grazing Response Index original paper that came out in '99 from Colorado. If the level is light to moderate up to 36% use, giving 64% of the plant leaf area still there to photosynthesize, then +1. If it's moderate, neutral, down to 50%, then a 0. But if it's heavy, more than 50% use, then it's -1. So we're not throwing away the intensity idea. We're just not relying on it as our only use criteria. And I suppose you could do the same thing with stubble height, and you could do the same thing with woody use or other metrics, because stocking rate is certainly not a useless tool. It's just not very uh, adequate for the whole set of questions that you're trying to deal with grazing management. But
It
the
cannot
really
tell the whole
big,
picture.
the
Agreed.
whole picture, yeah. But the really big one, it's worth 2 points, is the opportunity to grow or regrow. And, sometimes we have a need to jumpstart rest, or we want to give the plant the whole growing season to grow. And we can do that with dormant season grazing, and then it grows all growing season long. And we could do that every year. Some places thrive with that. The winter or the dormant season use removes the thatch, and then the plant just grows during the growing season. That would be +2. Most of the growing season as an opportunity to grow before the plant gets grazed or regrow after the plant gets grazed. That'd be a +1. Some opportunity, 0. Little opportunity, -1. And if it's grazed from the beginning to the end of the growing season, -2. So there's no opportunity for it to have leaves that are photosynthesizing without those leaves being removed by grazing. The simple math says -2 on that, because this growth is the big deal. It's what creates the food, it's what creates the plant, it's what creates the root system. And even though we look at the top, what's really important is the roots underground.
So there's three metrics to score, but in one pasture, we may have a 30,000 acre pasture here. Are you scoring the entire pasture? That might not be fair if you have a riparian area or two within that pasture that may have totally different scores based on the grazing scheme. Your
Well, you're right, because their growing seasons are differentially timed. If you come in right at the end of the upland growing season, then you might have a pretty good score for your grazing response index, your frequency, your intensity, and your opportunity for your upland plants. But if they're there during July and August and into September, because the come off date for your pasture is October, then you're going to be really hard on those riparian plants. And it could work in the opposite way with different season of use. But you ask a good question. Within this 30,000 acre pasture, which is a huge pasture, um, how do you get a good score? Well, the best way to get a good score is not have them graze all of it all the time, but to graze only a part of it some of the time, and then move on to another part of it, and they graze that some of the time. That is going to improve their frequency score. It's going to improve their opportunity score. And you haven't changed their intensity score because you haven't changed stocking rate at all.
Is it safe to say that if you're grazing for the majority of the year, um, that you will get a low score in this situation somewhere?
Well, no, it depends on how you do it. If you have the ability to move your animals, you could have a high grazing response index score everywhere. But you can't graze it all at once. I mean, you can't graze the big landscape or big pastures within the landscape for a long period of time and get a high score, because at least not during the growing season, because you're going to decrease your opportunity score and you're going
Mhm.
to decrease your frequency score, even if on average you're grazing those plants about right.
So let me maybe ask it a different way. Would be impossible to get the same high score across your entire ranch throughout the entire year? At some point, you're going to have to graze somewhere during the growing season. Is there one of these three metrics that has to go down, and maybe not to below standard, but it would have to go down just because cattle have to be somewhere during the growing season?
Well, yes, down from the maximum score of 4. because if you're not doing complete rest, you're not going to get a +2 on opportunity, but you could get a +1 if you're moving the animals. And you'd also, assuming you're doing moderate use, you're getting a 0 on your intensity. If you're doing light use across the whole year, then you could have a +1. But if you're stocked heavy, you'd have a -1, even if you're moving them. But let's assume you're moderately grazing. And so there's another point down. So now your maximum score is a +2. And then your frequency score, because you're grazing in the growing season, that all depends on how fast you're moving your animals, and that depends on how many paddocks you have. And you could get a +1 on that if you're moving them before the animals are ready to graze the plant the second time. So you don't necessarily have to be down below +2. But because you're grazing, you're not going to be +4, but that's all right. You're still positive. What
Hmm.
you don't
Hmm.
want to do is go negative with your score.
When I use the Grazing Response Index, I I very likely am going to get a low score somewhere on the ranch. And I've been okay with that as long as that low score is not in the same pasture or the same use area year after year. I've I have been okay with a low score as long as it's in pasture A this year, in use area C next year. Is that is that grazing beneficially?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When we did the Grazing Response Index workshops at 5 different ranches, and then we brought those people together for a workshop. One of the things that I wondered about is whether we should add a point to the Grazing Response Index for what you just talked about, the mixing it up. And the consensus seemed to be that the grazing response index is just fine the way it is. We don't need to add another point. We don't have to index everything that we do as a manager in order to have a useful tool. But it was also interesting because every one of those 5 ranches followed the principle of mixing it up from year to year to year. Every one of those 5 ranches was trying to give a higher ability for the plant to grow after they've had a potentially impactful year. The Humboldt Ranch, which was one of those 5, has their pastures scored with either of 2 colors. So they have something like a grazing response index, but it's red or green. And the red pastures that are uplands, they were there during the growing season, May and June. And for riparian areas, they were there in July and August. And if they were there in that pasture at those times, got scored red. But if they were there any other time of the year, they were green. And they try to not have back to back red years or too many red years.
If somebody's interested in using the Grazing Response Index, which I think is a powerful tool for not only planning your next year, but looking back and seeing how you did and managing and monitoring your own grazing management, where would they go to learn more about it? Is there a tool out there that they can quickly access?
If they go online, they can access the 1999 paper. It's in the 99 journal called Rangelands. But because some people don't have that available to them, you and I wrote an extension special publication that is also available through the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension about how you can use the Grazing Response Index to help you grow better plants. We also wrote another paper that describes how you could take a big pasture and divide it into use areas. And when you do that, you're going to have a higher score on average throughout the pasture. We also created a table that a rancher could put in their shirt pocket by folding it up, and then when they're on horseback leaving a pasture, they could take out a little stubby pencil and score the grazing response index at that moment, just as they're leaving the pasture, thinking about the utilization level, thinking about when the cows got in and how that was in the growing season, and thinking about this moment where that is in the growing season. And by scoring their grazing response index, not just their utilization level, but their whole index, they would have a way to think about how to do things better next year.
Is this something you could sit down at the end of the grazing season, cattle are home? Is it worthwhile to sit down and just reflect and do the GRI? Do you still find value in that?
Well, yes, and frankly, that's when most people do it because they forgot to have that folded piece of paper in their pocket. And if their memory is perfect, it'll be the same, but my memory isn't perfect, and so I forget, when I left a particular pasture with my animals, what the utilization was level was in that pasture sometimes, and I also forget what day I did it, and that's why we need this little book in our pocket, or these days there are apps, but some way of recording information, whether you do it on your phone or whether you do it on a piece of paper, it's much better when your memory is fresh.
That being said, I definitely have pulled it out in the fall and did a decent enough job of reconstructing things and used it as a very valuable tool for planning for the next year. The other thing about it is it's private and it does not take a degree in anything to get some good information out of there. You could sit down with that GRI sheet, even based on your memory, and have a pretty good idea of how the year went and how you might want to make changes for the next year. I think it's an incredibly valuable tool.
The label for it was perfect. It is not monitoring, it is a planning tool.
Agreed. I agree completely. And uh, it it's free to use. It's just your memory and a pencil. I want to thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we get some interest in GRI, or at least some more thought behind how we graze during the growing season. Thank you for coming on and speaking with us.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I'm honored that you asked me, and I really enjoyed the questions. I really enjoyed the conversation, and what you're doing is important. When people see a purpose for things like helping their business, they're going to want to apply things more often.
I agree. Ecology and economics have to go hand in hand. The word sustainable doesn't mean anything unless economics is in there also.